Now, we saw that the 20th chapter of John closed the way a book might close, with a summary statement. It certainly feels as if the Gospel of John should close with the last words in chapter 20. Thank you, Brad. It closed in chapter 20, verses 30 through 31 with these words, "Truly, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." So this is like winding it up, summarizing and saying, okay, I've said this much, I could say more, but this is enough. I've said enough on this subject, and it gives his purpose in writing it so that you will believe in Christ and have life. Certainly that'd be a very fitting close to the book. And therefore, many scholars believe that that was originally the close of the book, and that maybe John, after he had intended for the book to be closed, thought he might add one more memoir about a meeting that he and Peter and 5 other disciples had with Jesus at the Sea of Galilee, where a significant conversation took place between Jesus and Peter. Now, this may be true. We don't know. Or it may be that chapter 21 was added deliberately. It's clear that chapter 21 also ends the way we might expect the book to end. In chapter 21, verse 25, it says, "And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which, if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." Amen. So both chapter 20 and chapter 21 end with the statement, there are other things that could be recorded, but it would be unrealistic and unnecessary to try to make a comprehensive record of all that Jesus did. In the case of the closing words of chapter 20, he says the reason not to is that the amount I've given you should be sufficient. What we've seen in this record should be enough to lead you to faith in Christ. And at the end of chapter 21, the reason he says that we don't give more is that, where would it end? If I wish to be comprehensive, I would have to write so many books that, using obviously hyperbole, even the world itself couldn't contain those books. And so it's clear that 21 is written as an end of the book too, but it may have been an afterthought after the book had reasonably closed in chapter 20. But there is one more resurrection appearance that John wishes to share. And it is unique to the Gospel of John. Like so many other things in the Gospel, they're not recorded in the other Gospels. This one likewise is not found in the other Gospels. It says in chapter 21, verse 1, "After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias." That's the term that John's Gospel consistently uses for the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee. This body of water had a number of names. It was called the Sea of Galilee. Here it's called the Sea of Tiberias. It's also called Gennesaret, the Lake Gennesaret. But in John's Gospel, it's always called the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself: Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Now there's 7 men here, and all of them have been mentioned previously by name. At least the names that are mentioned here have been mentioned before, except for the sons of Zebedee. We have never read of the sons of Zebedee in the Gospel of John previously. Obviously, the writer is believed to be one of those sons of Zebedee, and he has referred to himself more obscurely as the other disciple in some cases where he was with another, or as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And it is believed that he was John, and therefore the sons of Zebedee is a reference to himself and his brother James. But it's interesting that we would find that expression, the sons of Zebedee, here when the Gospel of John has never previously mentioned who they are, has not mentioned Zebedee or James or John by name. But it is presumed that the sons of Zebedee are known to the readers, that is who they are. And then for some reason 2 other of his disciples are mentioned but not named. It seems like after giving the names of 5 of them, or at least identifying who 5 of them were, it would not be any trouble to add the names of the other 2 as well, but for whatever reasons they are omitted. And Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." And they said to him, "We're going with you also." And they went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. It is often suggested by commentators that Peter did something wrong by choosing to go fishing again. They say, well, you know, when he first met Jesus, Jesus called him away from fishing. Fishing was something that was part of his old life, his old vocation, and Jesus had called him away from fishing to be a disciple, and now Peter seemingly is discouraged in going back to his old way. Well, this is seemingly, to my mind, very unfair. The Bible does not criticize Peter for this. What is he supposed to be doing? Jesus has not yet commissioned them to go to all the world and teach all nations. They are really just filling in time between unpredictable appearances of Jesus. You know, they've gone back to Galilee where they live. From time to time, but not very often, Jesus appears to them. But what are they supposed to do in between? Now the time will come when he'll actually commission them to go to all the world, but he'll also tell them to wait in Jerusalem until they are endued with power from on high. So they really are not supposed to be out preaching quite yet. But what are they supposed to do? Obviously they have no instructions from him. It should not be thought that going fishing is a return to the old life, as if Jesus called Peter from fishing as some kind of an unworthy activity. After all, Jesus had instructed Peter to fish. One time even during their time together, when he told him to go and throw a hook in the water and pull up the first fish and find a coin in its mouth to pay the temple tax for himself and Peter. Nothing was wrong with Peter fishing, it's just that when Jesus had been with him, there were more important things to do. With Jesus gone, and without any specific assignment being given to them, there's no reason for them not to fish. What are they going to do? They might as well use their time productively. However, on this occasion, it didn't prove productive at all. They fished all night and didn't catch anything at all. And when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. It may be that they were too far distant to recognize him, or maybe it was foggy that morning and they could just make out that there's some individual there on the shore. Nothing surprising about someone being on the shore of the lake, so they didn't have any suspicions about this being another appearance of the risen Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "Children, have you any food?" And they answered him, "No." Now, it must have seemed strange to them that he called them children. Actually, Jesus didn't generally call his disciples children, so it's not as if that was a common term for him to use, as if they say, "Oh, that must be Jesus." But it certainly wouldn't seem to be a very normal thing for an ordinary man to say to strangers, to adult men, calling them children. And I've never heard any explanation of why this term would have been used or how the disciples would have reacted to being addressed as children. It's a peculiar thing. And their statement, "no," might have had a note of annoyance in it. They had gone all night without sleep. It's often hard not to be annoyed by small things when you haven't had any sleep all night. Plus, they have the discouragement of having wasted their night fishing and taking nothing in. And then this individual on the shore, unknown, unrecognized by them, refers to them by this diminutive title. I would assume they might have a little bit of irritation in their response. And then he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." Now, how strange that those instructions must have seemed to them, not yet knowing this was Jesus. If they knew it was Jesus, then they'd remember, "Oh, he told us to do something like that before, and we caught a bunch of fish." And so they would trust him and say, "Okay, we'll do it." Remember, the first time Peter was called to be a disciple, according to Luke chapter 5, it was because Jesus had been preaching in his boat, and after he'd sent the crowds away, he said to Peter, "Put your net in the water for a catch of fish." And Peter said, "Well, Lord, you know, we've been fishing all night and we haven't caught anything." But he said, "At your word, I'll do it." He knew it was Jesus. He respected Jesus. It seemed like an unrealistic suggestion, but hey, who's going to say no to the master? And so Peter did it. But on this occasion, he didn't know it was the master. What a strange thing it must have seemed to think that a man on the shore would be able to see a shoal of fish in the water out that far out where the disciples couldn't see them. You might think that they would have just scoffed and done nothing in response to this suggestion, but I guess they figured no one would make that suggestion unless he had reason to do so, and maybe they thought at the angle he was seeing, he could see there was some fish over on that side of the boat that they were not able to see from the angle they were looking. Whatever reason, they complied with the command. And it says, so they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of the fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Now, recognizing Jesus in this case was a matter of recognizing his characteristic actions. This was not the first time they'd had a supernatural catch of fish. It was the second. And the first time surprised them as much as this time. It was after an unproductive time of fishing, but now that they're following his instructions, they succeed. And John just sees the likeness. He can't help but see this is not just a miracle, this is another miracle of the type that Jesus did before. And he recognizes in the characteristic providence here, the Lord's hand. Now, it is desirable for us to be able to recognize God's activity in our lives. And a lot of times, although we know as a matter of doctrine that he's always present, and we probably don't have any doubts about that as a matter of theology, we often don't have any real sense that it is so. I mean, we're not aware of working and acting and doing our duties and so forth under his gaze. Like I said, we may know it as a matter of theology, but knowing it by revelation is not always the case. And yet there's many times when we see an answer to prayer so striking, or a characteristic providence of Christ, that we say, wow, that's the Lord. You know, I mean, I recognize, it's like when Jacob had his dream and he woke up and said, wow, the Lord is in this place and I didn't know it. It's like we've been in the presence of God, but until he does something recognizable, since he is invisible, when he does something visible and recognizable, then his presence becomes something that we're more aware of. It's like a revelation of his presence with us. And those times of recognition of his presence are the things that kind of spark enthusiasm in our walk with God, that we see his hand at work around us. Remember, Nehemiah and Ezra both were seeing the hand of God upon themselves in the amazing ways in which God opened doors for them by giving them favor in the eyes of the king of Persia, or doing other things. This is because the good hand of God was upon them. They saw the hand of God in it. And we need to have our senses aroused to recognize the hand of God in situations that other people might not see them in. John was the first to recognize this is the hand of the Lord. That's Jesus there. Because don't you remember? This kind of thing happened before, and it was Jesus then, it's Jesus now. That's the Lord. And when Peter heard that, and Peter must have been a little slower on the uptake because he didn't deduce that as quickly as John, but when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord from John, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and he plunged into the sea. Now he's going to swim ashore, and normally you'd expect someone to take off some of their clothes if they're going to try to swim, rather than add clothing onto their body. Because you don't want to encumber your arms and legs. You're out in the middle of the lake, you don't want to drown. And to have soggy, heavy, wet clothing on you is not an advantage in swimming. And so some have thought that Peter was stripped down to maybe total nudity, working there in the boat. It was probably a hot evening. It was, of course, early summer or late spring. They were laboring hard, and it may be that there wasn't any stigma attached to people taking off their clothes when they're only around other guys and working like that. Or at least it is believed he was stripped down to his underwear so that he didn't feel presentable And so he actually, even though it would encumber him more in swimming, he put his clothing on, put on his outer garment, because he was not in his present condition presentable. And he plunged into the sea, and the other disciples came in the little boat. For they were not far from the land, but about 200 cubits. So about 300 feet, about the length of a football field is how far they had to bring it in. And they were dragging the net with the fish. So even though they were eager to see Jesus, they weren't eager to give up the fish either. It slowed them down. Peter didn't want to be slowed down. Being impulsive as he always was, he just jumped into the water. He could have just ridden in the boat with the others, but he wanted to get there first. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. So Jesus had found some fish and bread. Where he got the bread, it's hard to say. It's unlikely that he baked it there on the shore. And it's also not probable that he supernaturally turned rocks into bread or made bread materialize magically or miraculously. We don't know where he got the bread, but he may have walked into town and bought it, in the marketplace. The resurrected Jesus, it's hard to say. This is left unexplained where the bread came from. The fish, we presume, came out of the sea. How Jesus got them, we don't know, but he might have just commanded them to come. You never know. He had command over nature. But we have him with a regular breakfast, such as they might normally have, already hot and waiting for them, but not enough for all of them. So he tells them to bring some fish of their own. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have caught just now." So Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Now, it was not the disciples that dragged the net to shore, it was Peter. Peter had not helped drag it to the shore. The others had to row the boat, pulling this heavy load. Against the strain of that resistance, he hadn't had any participation, so he let them rest and he pulled the net all to shore, and they counted the fish, which is interesting that they would do so, because you'd think they'd be so enamored with Jesus, they'd say, who cares about the fish, let's put them back in the water or just let them rot on the shore. Jesus is here, we don't get to see him every day. But some of them were fishermen, and they really wanted it to go on record how many fish they caught. It may be that they only counted them after all this story was over. Maybe even after Jesus disappeared, they may have gone back to the nets and counted, but we know the number. Many people have tried to make some significance of the number, 153 fish. Jerome, for example, claimed that the Greeks had listed 153 nations of the earth, 153 ethnic nations, and that each fish represented one of them, so that as Peter and the others were called to be fishers of men, it suggests that they're going to all nations, like they bring in fish from every nation, one fish representing each one. However, it's not really clear that there ever really were 153 nations. Jerome said so, but he cited a source which actually says there were 157. So he may have altered it just to fit the number of the fishes. It's hard to say. In order to find some, mystical significance in the number of fish that's given, people have come up with all kinds of ways of saying, well, it's, if you take the square of 12 and the square of 3 and add them together, you come up with 153, or, they come up with all kinds of things like that. But if it's that hard to find significance in the number, maybe there is no significance in the number. If you have to go to mathematical, Bible codes and things like that to figure it out, then I have a suspicion it's artificial. The number is no doubt given because it was a large number, and it was an unusually large number of fish to pull up in one net, and they had counted them, so they knew the number, so they gave the number. Not that the number itself had symbolic significance, it gives us an impression of the size of the catch. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. As I said in our previous session, that is one of the most peculiar sentences in the Gospel of John. They didn't dare to ask him who he was. Certainly that wording suggests that they very much wanted to, but they didn't dare do so. Like, he might scold them for asking who he was. But they did know it was him. But they kind of wanted to ask anyway. As I said in the previous lecture, I don't know what to make of this except that trying to put myself in their position, seeing Jesus glorified, he might have actually looked a little different in some ways. His characteristics, his face and so forth might have had some differences about it, although he still had the marks from his crucifixion, so he had the same body. And even, it's just probable that they just were, it was just a surreal situation. They could hardly believe that it was him. They knew it was, but they wanted to pinch themselves perhaps or verify it somehow. But they didn't dare to ask. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. And this is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Not if you take all the accounts. It means this is the third reference in this gospel. He had appeared to them twice, the gathered disciples. And it says to them, to his disciples. He had appeared to Mary, and then twice to the disciples, and this is the third time to the disciples, the fourth time, if you include Mary, and obviously the writer is not including Mary, and therefore not including all occurrences. It's not trying to tell us that he hadn't appeared yet to the two men on the road to Emmaus, or that he had not appeared to James at this time. What it's telling us is that the gathered group of disciples, this is the third time now that they've had occasion to see him. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter. Now this is, this section that we're about to read at the end is no doubt the reason for the addition of this chapter. Not just to give us another case of a miracle Jesus did, but rather to give us the significant conversation between Jesus and Peter. And it does not tell us that they got up and walked and had a private conversation, but it would seem to be implied because it says in verse 20, which is part of the same narrative, then Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following. So apparently Jesus and Peter were in motion because they were being followed. So after breakfast, apparently Peter and Jesus got up and took a walk along the shore where this conversation took place. And John stayed close by. Not necessarily to eavesdrop, but just not wanting to get far from Jesus probably. He probably stayed far enough away to give them their privacy. But it says, so when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And he said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Now, this segment here is unusual in that John uses several sets of synonyms. And when he could use the same words in the positions. For example, 3 times he is asked, Peter is asked if he loves Jesus. Twice the question uses the word agape for love. And the third time, the word phileo for love, a different Greek word. Now these words do have some difference in nuance, but they are commonly used in John earlier interchangeably. They are synonyms. They are different words for love, and it's true that in some contexts they do carry slightly different nuances. And then also the word know is used twice. When Peter says, you know all things, you know that I love you, the word know is not the same. They are synonyms. 2 different Greek words for know are used. So here we have a segment where the same thing is being said 3 times. And yet, there's at least 4 cases in it where the words changed using synonyms for them. And no doubt there is a tendency on many people's part to try to find the reason why he says lambs in one case and sheep in another case, or why he says feed in one case and tend in another case, or why know is one word the first time and know is a different word the second time. I've never heard any convincing exposition of why these changes would be significant. However, there are lots of teachers who try to find significance in the change from agape to phileo. Because twice Jesus says, Peter, do you agape me? Peter's answer every time is phileo. So Jesus says, do you agape me? And Peter says, I phileo you. Jesus said, do you agape me? Peter says, I phileo you. And then Jesus says, well, do you phileo me? And that's when Peter was grieved that Jesus asked him, do you phileo me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know I phileo you. Phileo and agape, as I said, are synonyms, but agape is also a word that is used often, not in every context, of a more divine type of love. The love of God for us, the love of Christ for us, is said to be agape in the Greek. And the love that Jesus commands us to have for each other is also agape. When Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, it's the word agape. Because of this, because the love of God for us and our love for God and for each other is said to be agape, it is often said that agape is a higher form of love than mere human love. It is an unconditional love. It is eternal love. It is unflinching and indestructible love. And yet phileo is another Greek word, and it means family love. Love that you'd have for your brother or for a family member. It's affection. And so some have said that what Jesus is asking Peter the first two times is, do you have this selfless, self-giving love for me? And Peter can only say, I am fond of you. I have affection for you. And Peter is asked the same question twice and gives the same answer. So Jesus then modifies the question, well, are you fond of me? Do you have affection for me? And maybe even questioning whether that is true. This change from agape to phileo is a common theme when people preach on this passage, to make it clear that there is a difference. However, in the Aramaic, which they were probably speaking, there may not be the same distinction as in the Greek. And therefore, agape and phileo can both be Greek translations of the same Aramaic word. And we don't know whether the same Aramaic word was used throughout in the conversation, but John is simply using different Greek words, as he does with sheep and lambs and tend and feed and know and know. That it'd be more a matter of stylistic preference to not have too much recurrence of the same word in a short space. Some translators actually are sensitive to that too, in that they'll, in the same Greek word in several places, they'll give different English words. In fact, in 1 John, there's a place where the same Greek word is used 3 times in one sentence, or 2 sentences in one verse. And the King James translators have translated that word as continue, remain, and abide. 3 different English words for the same Greek word in one verse in 1 John. And that's just because sometimes translators feel like it's a little burdensome to just repeat the same word over and over again, so for stylistic reasons they change it. Peter may have used the same Aramaic word that Jesus used. We don't know. And that John, for stylistic reasons, may have chosen different Greek words, as is the case with so many of the synonyms used in this little pericope. Pericope. I always have a hard time pronouncing that word properly. Pericope. You know what that is? Pericope. It's a little paragraph, a section of the Gospels. It's called a pericope. And so this little pericope has all these instances of synonyms in it that need to be explained or not. Maybe they don't need to be explained. It may be that Jesus was using different Aramaic words than Peter was using. We just don't know which words in Aramaic were being used. John, however, and translated this way, might have been intending to bring out such a difference that was intended. Even if Jesus and Peter used the same Aramaic words, John, in writing this, may have known by inspiration or simply by insight that when Jesus was asking the question the first two times, he meant it in a different way. He meant something like agape. And when Peter answered, he meant it something like phileo, and so John used these different Greek words. Agape, after all, would be a self-sacrificing love. Jesus said, greater agape has no man than this, than that he lay down his life for his friends. Peter, in the upper room, had protested to Jesus that even if all the others forsook Jesus, he would not, and he would be willing to lay his life down for him. He had protested that he had this kind of love for Jesus. And then when it came down to it, and he had occasion to really put his money where his mouth was, he backed down, and he denied Jesus 3 times, showing that he did not quite have that kind of love for Jesus, as he had protested. Once more, Peter had said at that time, even if the others deny you, I won't. He had protested a superior loyalty to Jesus, superior to the other disciples. So when Jesus asked the question the first time, he says, do you love me more than these? Apparently meaning more than these other disciples do. Now, an alternate way of seeing that question would be, do you love me more than these fish? People who think that Peter had kind of backslidden back to fishing again, which is, I think, an unfair assessment of the situation. But those who like to explain the story that way would say, Jesus is now saying, well, do you love these fish more than you love me? Or do you love me more than you love these? But I don't think that's the meaning of his statement. I think he's asking, do you love me more than these other disciples do? After all, you once told me you do. And then you didn't. And it's interesting that there were 3 times that Jesus was denied by Peter. And there's 3 times he's given Peter the chance to give the right answer.